Last night was one of those nights where my eyes popped open at 1 o'clock and I knew it was useless to try and sleep, so I got up and wrote a sermon and then promptly got tired about 6 o'clock in the morning and came to church today and forgot my computer. So all of my sermon is at home, but thank you to my son who offered to lend me his laptop, and I don't even know whether what's on the laptop is what I wrote, but we'll see how we go. Is that all right? So just wanted to say a big welcome to you all. Lenny, how are you going with your leg? You slowly getting better? You've got a good carer. Oh, who reckons Bob's a saint? We all reckon Bob's a saint. Lenny, I think you've made him the man that he is. I reckon he was a bit rough around the edges when you got him. Miwa, take some lessons off Auntie Lynn. She'll show you how to beat a man into shape. You've turned out all right, Bob. You've turned out all right. Yeah. And I'm sorry to be rude, but I can't remember your name. Sorry? Taylor. Thank you so much for coming to visit us. Where are you from, Taylor? Oh, who's heard of Nashville, Tennessee in the US? The home of what, Taylor? Country music. Who loves country music? Who believes that when we get to heaven that the angel Gabriel will be strumming a banjo or an electric guitar or have a harmonica or something like that? Taylor, is that the way it's going to be? Hope so. Okay. Yeah. Well, we all love Nashville, Tennessee. Have you heard of the Gaithers? And they're very big in America, and they're kind of like the Christian country and Western gurus. They're very big anyway. I love them. I'm a big fan. So Nashville, we connect. We're very, very glad that you can be here, Taylor. If you're hungry for some potato and beans, please stay for lunch afterwards. We'll be happy to share some with you if you like. Before we open the word and speak today, I just want to ask if you will bow your heads as we pray again. Father in heaven, from time to time, the attention of the world is caught as they realise the thin veneer that protects them from incivility. And Lord, we are living right now with one of those moments where around the world people's hearts are somewhat troubled and anxious because of the events that are transpiring. And I just pray that as we share again today our love for you and our belief that you started this world and you will finish it in a way in which you will demonstrate that your character and the principles that undergird your government are the ones that only can be successful in achieving peace and stability and love. Lord, may that truth change who we are and make us useful in this community is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So as long as I've been part of this church, you will have heard me talk to you often that the outlook in the human sphere of experience for peace and prosperity is somewhat bleak. Would you agree? How many of you have not been watching the news recently and are unaware that right now the world has been rattled by a phenomena that we call the coronavirus or COVID-19 or SARS something. I think we're all aware, aren't we? We've all been impacted. Anyone who has a share or stock on the Australian share market will have seen their shares' value decrease significantly. In fact, I think Wall Street over the last week has had only the third 1,000 point drop in a day in human history. And around the world, people are anxious about what could happen if this virus turns from an isolated pocket of event into a global pandemic. No amount of insurance is going to protect us from the fires, from the floods, from the viruses, from the economic collapse that the world is, I guess, fending off at the moment. We kind of protect ourselves with what I would describe as a thin veneer of civility. Would you agree? Where we can create this notion in our mind that somehow we have enough contingency plan in place so that if we get sick, we've got health insurance. If there's a fire, we've got a firefighting pump and a big hose. If there's a cyclone, we've got a cyclone-rated tin roof. We create this picture, I guess, that makes us feel somewhat safe. But every now and again, something like the coronavirus comes along for which there is no cure that suddenly exposes, I guess, our vulnerability. And there might be some here today who, unlike me, don't have red figures at the bottom of their bank balances with 6 or 7 zeros after it. You might have walled yourself off in a nice little house somewhere there in Federal, and you have no debt, and you've got a bubbling creek and cows for milk and a few orange trees, and you can create this idea that I'm ready, I'm there. But how many of you think that we could survive for too long in the face of a global economic collapse? Would the tins of nut meat we've got stocked up in our back shed and the maybe year's supply of So Good and Wheat Bix really protect us for too long? Or do you think that if the world goes down, we're all going to feel the pain? Now, there would be wise people among us, certainly sitting up the back, Heidi, who's quite smart, got a very good ATAR and has a job that you can only get into with genius. And she kind of alluded to me that maybe we're making too much of this whole virus thing, and that the world has had flus come and go and pandemics rise and fall, and that, you know, a 1% mortality was kind of in the Spanish flu around the early 20th century, and this virus is probably a similar kind of, I guess, intensity and has a similar mortality rate to some of those ones like SARS or whatever. And it could all be contained, and by the northern spring it could all fizzle out and disappear. And that's very possible, isn't it? And the share market could bounce back next week, and all of the investors that are looking for an opportunity to expose the fear that has happened with this, they could all pile in, and all of a sudden we could be back at record highs. And there will be optimists among us who will say, yeah, well, nah, it's all good. But I would have to say that for the first time in a very long time in my dental clinic, the general attitude of people to this current crisis is at a different level than has been for some of the other things that have happened. Have you noticed that? And it's not surprising that 2,000 years ago, Jesus predicted that as we get to the close of this earth's history, that people will be fainting from fear, from the expectation of what is coming on the world. Do you think Jesus was on the money? Do you think that this world is in a position where economically, environmentally, physically, in terms of our health, and in every sphere of human endeavour, there are challenges out there that have harbingers of a foreboding future if everything goes belly up? Bob? Yeah, I think that there is... Yeah, I think that there is a collision of a multifactorial scenario that is out there in the world today that is making people nervous. And we know in the capitalist mindset when people are nervous because stocks fall, shares go down, people start buying gold, and they flee for safety. But as Christians, Jesus has said to us that when this kind of environment starts to happen, and when people start to express an awareness that their own barns that they have erected for themselves to give themselves protection and the ability to be resilient through times of crisis, when people realise that perhaps there is no Tower of Babel that they can build for themselves high enough to escape the oncoming tsunami, Jesus says when these things begin to happen, stand up, be bold, be confident, lift up your heads. Why? Because your redemption is drawing near. And as Christians, we know how the story ends. How does the story end? In triumph? In glory? In victory? Is Jesus a big enough God to look at the problems facing the earth and go, you know what? I can solve this. I can sort this. As Christians, we believe that Jesus will come back to this breaking earth and will be able to say to all those that have put their confidence in him, I am here to rescue you. This is a moment where with the prophet Isaiah we can say, look, here is our God, we have waited for him and he delivered us. Here is the Lord, we waited for him, let us rejoice and celebrate his deliverance. Is there anyone here who's homesick for heaven? You know, I'm pretty lucky down here. You would have to say that living with Yvette, I'm living the dream. Would you agree? If you've ever tasted her cooking, or if you've seen how she can just make mess go away, I'm living the dream. Yeah. And in many senses, when I compare my life and my existence to that of many of the billions of people in the world who can't afford shoes or haven't got access to the internet or haven't got protection from the rain and the elements, I think that there are many of us here who are really, really blessed to have a great existence here. But even with all the blessings that we have, I'm still aware that within my circle and my network, there are people who are very close to me whose relationships are in crisis, who are having to take out aggravated violence orders against their partners, who are trying to protect their children from just relationship breakdown. And in a civilised country like Australia, is there anybody here in this audience who isn't closely affiliated with somebody's story in which there is pain and there is hurt and there is brokenness? I think all of us are too close to the problem of evil and sin to feel comfortable in living here forever. We are homesick for heaven. We want the day where truth and righteousness, kindness and love and justice and fairness and equity and mercy rule without competition. Where greed and pride and selfishness and all of those consequences of living with brokenness and sin are done away with. I'm homesick for heaven. How about you? Jesus said to his disciples when it became evident that the Jews were not embracing him as the Messiah and that there was a possibility that they would suffer at the hands of an angry Sanhedrin. Don't let your hearts be distressed. You've got confidence in God, have confidence in me. There are many dwelling places in my Father's house. If it weren't so, I would have told you. And because I am going away to make a place for you, and if I go and make a place for you, I will come again, so that where I am, there you will be also. We ought to be the best citizens we can in this world. Would you agree? We ought to invest in the communities in which we exist. We ought to be responsible for the environment and use our money and gifts responsibly. We shouldn't have a to heck with it attitude because Jesus is coming to make it all right. Let's at least give him something to clean up. This is not the right attitude for a Christian. We should be, to the best of our ability, seeking to instill the principles of God's kingdom in the community in which we exist. But ultimately, as Christians, we know that our final postcode is not 2481. Would you agree? Our final destiny is not Byron Bay. Our ultimate goal is not a mansion on Watergoes Beach with panoramic sea views. Our ultimate goal is to be with Jesus, to be in the place that he has gone to prepare for us. Christ has promised to come again and to take us from this decaying and failing world to a place that defies imagination. Have you ever tried to imagine what heaven will be like? When I was a kid, it was all about dolphins and being able to endlessly barefoot water ski around the oceans and to fly like a bird and to experience all of these realities that were beyond my capacity as a human being. But I think as I've weathered and withered, I'm becoming more and more interested in relational integrity, of being able to make friends and to keep those friends for eternity, and to experience no pain and suffering and breakdown of human connection. I don't know what heaven means for you, but I'm looking forward to it. And I'm really glad that as Christians, Jesus has said that in times of trouble and impending doom, don't let your hearts be distressed. Have confidence that my plan will come to fruition. Even though you can't see me or touch me or feel me in the physical form, I have a plan, and I've gone away to prepare a place for you, and you can be assured that I will come again and rescue you and take you to be with me, so that where I am, there you can be too. Not long after Jesus spoke these words, the very people who claimed to be looking for a Messiah nailed him to a cross. And for a while, the disciples' hopes that he was the promised Messiah were dashed. But only for a day or two. Because on that Sunday morning, a resurrection occurred that changed their understanding about who Jesus was. No longer were their views of his messianic role limited to solving the problems of the Palestinian, Jewish, Roman conflict. They now saw that this Jesus had beaten death on a global scale, and that his mission and his ministry was not just to rescue a few clans of the tribe of Judah centred around Jerusalem and Galilee, but rather he was the saviour of the entire world, and his rescue plan encompassed all of creation. Jesus had come to set the whole human race free from the tyranny of sin. And because Jesus had beaten death, the disciples recognised that he was the captain of the whole of humanity, that he was forming a new team, and that anybody who joined his team could share his victory. The promise of Christ's return became the centre of a movement that revolutionised the first century, and indeed every century after it. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, was a late addition to the team, but perhaps one of the leading influences of the early church. He traversed the Roman Empire, preaching that Jesus was the resurrected Messiah, and that as a resurrected representative of the whole human race, Jesus was now in heaven preparing a place for all who would put their trust in him. Paul was not afraid to face the inevitable martyr's death that awaited him in Rome at the hand of Nero. He knew that a crown of victory awaited him, and he was confident that God would be faithful and fulfill his promise. In perhaps one of the last letters that he is thought to have written to his young friend Timothy, he writes this: "I think my time is nearly up. I have competed well. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. There is waiting for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me in that day, and not just to me, but to all who have set their affection on his appearing." It's May 1982, and there is a squabble going on in the South Atlantic between Argentina and Britain over a small group of islands that is claimed by both nations. Is there anyone here old enough to remember the Falklands War? A couple of you? Britain has declared a 200-mile exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, and the hostility is rising. According to historians, the British become aware by listening into the Argentinian communications that there is an assault about to be planned on perhaps 3 May. And so they launch an offensive. And a British nuclear-powered submarine fired 3 torpedoes at an Argentinian warship called the General Belgrano on the 2nd of May, 1982. And the General Belgrano went to a watery grave, taking with it 323 Argentinian soldiers. The attack occurred outside the 200-mile exclusion zone, and historians have been arguing ever since as to whether or not the Royal Navy acted within the rules of war, or whether this was an act of aggression. 4 years later, there is a World Cup being played in Mexico, and England gets to meet Argentina in the quarter-final. Can you imagine that? If you follow football in Australia, I think there was a time in Sydney where they had to reorganise the whole A-League because there was just so much fighting going on between the Serbians and the Croats and the various clans of different forms of Italians, and they just couldn't resolve the issue, so they just had to disband all of the clubs and start again. But I suspect that the tension between Argentinian and English supporters at that World Cup in 1986 might have been on another level. Would you agree? And at the end of the first half, it was 0-0. Then about 8 or 9 minutes into the second half, Diego Maradona, a rising star in the world of football, leaps up to try and head the ball over the outstretched arm of the British goalkeeper, and the ball ends up in the net to the cheers of the crowd. The referee and 2 linesmen had failed to see that Diego Maradona had not headed the ball into the net, but punched it with his fist. Now, I don't know if there's any of you here who follow football, or soccer as we call it in Australia, but soccer really is a game that only has one rule, and that is you can't touch the ball. There's a few other civilised rules, like you can't kick someone else in the shins, and you can't pretend to be a sook and fall over, and there's a few other rules. You can't run ahead of your opponents. But ultimately, football is about the art of moving a ball around the field with anything other than your hands. And so for Diego Maradona to score a goal in the 1986 World Cup with his fist was a travesty of soccer justice. And in the press conference after the match, when there were so many protests by so many people who had seen what had happened, Diego Maradona said this in his press conference: "The first goal that I scored was partly with my head and partly with the hand of God." And so this goal has gone down in history as the hand of God. It was an amazing match. There was a second goal scored not long after the hand of God goal, which is now known as the goal of the century. So if you're bored, have nothing to do tomorrow morning, get on YouTube and Google goal of the century and hand of God and remind yourself of the history. Because there is more at stake in this match than merely the referee getting it wrong. People in Argentina were still stinging that England had cheated them out of the Falkland Islands by operating outside the rules of engagement. And in a sense, many people in Argentina felt there was sweet justice that they had beaten England on the soccer field by having a referee who failed to apply the rules of soccer. And as I think about this event in human history, I'm old enough to remember it. I want to ask myself the question and share it with you. Is it right that one wrong is offset by another? Who feels that I can hit you because you hit me first? It's not a concept that rugby league has embraced in Australia. We don't watch soccer as much in New South Wales as rugby league, but there's a few world famous state of origin matches where there's been an all-in melee. And the kind of unwritten rule of the crowd is that as long as you're not the first person to swing, it's okay. They hit you and you're a real man, what are you allowed to do? Hit them back. Who here feels comfortable with that kind of philosophy? You can hear children screaming, can't you? But she pulled my hair first. Say, well, that's no excuse to put her in the microwave and turn her on high. I would like to suggest that human history really is very much like the World Cup in 1986, where there is this constant cycle of people using somebody else's misbehaviour as an excuse for them to exercise a new misdemeanour. And I would like to suggest that God does not buy into this argument that because somebody has committed a wrong, he is justified in committing another. And so I am intrigued in this passage that Paul has written to Timothy. In some sense, we could argue that Jesus is the divine referee who has been granted the power to blow the whistle and bring to end the competition that has been occurring on this earth between two competing narratives, Is that metaphor okay for you? We can look at what is going on in the great controversy as a competition between good and evil. And in this passage, as Paul writes to Timothy, he says something about the nature of who God is. And he describes God in these terms: the Lord, the righteous judge. And I want to ask you a question. If Jesus, being all-powerful and all-knowing, was refereeing the match in which Diego Maradona scored the hand of God goal, do you think he would have blown the whistle and said, "That's not right"? Or would he have thought about the context of the Falkland Islands and say, it's appropriate that Argentina, being deprived of the Falkland Islands, can now get back one on the bully that came down with a massive army and just took away what they believe was rightfully theirs? What do you think? What do you think it means to be a righteous judge? In the Old Testament, what were the judges implored to do? Levi? Yeah, and Michael is on the money. The judges are constantly reminded that they are to be impartial. And their judgment is to be no difference whether they're judging the rich man or the poor, the influential man or the person that has no influence. They are to judge according to the principles of the community contract that they have made with God to uphold laws of fairness and righteousness and honesty. Do we sometimes get upset when we see court outcomes that tend to indicate that he with the most expensive lawyer wins? I think we all recoil and rebel against that, don't we? And I would like to suggest that when God has been called the righteous judge, he has the capacity to judge not only rightly, but also fairly. I think there is inherent in the text the answer given into how God will make his judgment as to on which team we finally end up and on whose uniform we finally get to wear. And in the text it says this: "The righteous judge will award a crown of victory to me in that day, and not to me only, but to who? To all who have set their affection on his appearing." God is letting us know in this text the criteria he has for sorting the wheat from the weeds. We as human beings always default to a legal and contractual sense of fee for service. Would you agree? We become contractual and transactional in our relationships. We want to balance the parity of exchange of goods. And the Jews in Jesus' day were very transactional in the way they understood their relationship with God. They wanted to know what they had to do in order to be entitled to the blessings of God. The Jews came to Jesus and they said this: "What must we do to accomplish the deeds God requires?" What must we do? If I do this, what will God do for me? You know, I like Donald Trump. Who likes Donald Trump? Donald Trump has provided for me a great source of entertainment and amusement. He is a president like no other. He just breaks all of the mould, and he stands apart from all of his predecessors in being a very unique and charismatic and unusual kind of president in the United States. And Taylor, how is he received in Nashville? Is that a red state?
It is, but in Nashville it's not a red state.
Yeah. If Donald came to town, would there be like mass crowds cheering him, or would?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But there'd also be people doing it.
Yeah. That's America. We love America. Americans, I might be incorrect in saying this, Taylor, but having worked with a lot of American missionaries, Americans love the wrestle of ideas. They like to, from my observation, they like to put it all on the table and discuss and express their views and put it all into the pot and see what the stew looks like at the end of the thing. Australians tend to be a bit more indifferent towards the political argument and debate. We'd rather just have a barbecue and talk about the football. But Americans have had long discussions about political ideology. And in America, you can have long discussions about almost anything, can't you? You can talk about, a pro-life or a pro-choice, or you can talk about euthanasia, or you can talk about marriage equality, or any of these issues will start a conversation. Guns, yeah. In Australia, they will often shut conversations down, and we'll just try and avoid conflict and not go there. But Donald, he's out there, and I really like him, President Trump. And he did something this year which I thought was really, really interesting. He brought a new Latin phrase into the common vernacular. Can anybody guess what it is? It's a Latin phrase that Donald has brought into the vernacular. Who's heard of the quid pro quo quote from Donald Trump? There's been a whole hoo-ha in the US government, and I think they've had a whole impeachment case over this idea that Donald somehow was talking to President Zelensky of the Ukraine and said, hey, how about digging up some dirt on my boy Joe Biden in exchange for $430 million of military aid to stand up against your big bully neighbour Putin and his cronies. And I don't know how it went down, but obviously there were some people in the US government that were quite upset about it. Nancy Pelosi, who I think is the Speaker of the House, is that right, Taylor? Got a bit of a bee in a bonnet, and they rallied around and they pushed through a vote to impeach Donald Trump, and he came along and all sorts of people stood up and gave testimony. But the people who were hovering around like hawks waiting for the story snapped this picture, these notes that he was holding in his hand, where he got up and he just said, there has been no quid pro quo. And who now is intelligent enough to explain to me what the Latin means, quid pro quo? I had to Google it, I'm not bright enough. But you guys are much more intelligent than me. Come on, Heidi, you're the genius up the back. Quid pro quo in Latin, any idea? Jared, you're at uni. Charlie, you're doing law, you know Latin. Come and help me out. It basically just means this for that. Yeah, this for that. And in legal speak and in economic speak, quid pro quo refers to the fact that I give you something with the expectation you're giving me something back. There's going to be a transaction, there's going to be an implied contract that by me bringing home the potatoes, you'll cook them and mash them. Yeah? This is the quid pro quo transactional kind of way of thinking. And Donald Trump stood up and boldly proclaimed to a press conference when he was questioned as to what had gone down with him and President Zelensky, that there was no quid pro quo. If you read his notes, I want nothing, I want nothing, I want no quid pro quo. Isn't it lovely to know that the President of the United States of America is immersed in new covenant theology? That he's won the victory over transactional arrangements, where all of the US foreign aid is invested in countries around the world with no expectation of anything in return. Marilla's looking a little bit cynical, but I think that might be what he was trying to get across. Was he convincing? Look, I think if you vote Republican, you would hope he was convincing. He beat his impeachment. But certainly the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi and a great swathe of the media were not convinced by Donald's argument. And they believed that there very much was quid pro quo going on. And having been a missionary and worked in multiple third world and developing countries, I can say that nearly all US foreign aid in those countries is tied very much to a transactional understanding that if we give you money, we expect loyalty, votes on the US Security Council, adherence to some of our economic policies and frameworks, military denuclearization, etc., etc. And I think that we will find that most of society is based on quid pro quo. If you come to see me as a dentist, I'm going to ask for your credit card before you get out the door. Even though I profess to be a kind man, my business will not survive long without some sense of transactional economy. But I want to ask you, because we're not here to talk about politics or philosophy or the economy, does God work on a transactional basis? Is it a fair question? God, what do we have to do? What do we have to give you in order that you will give us? And what did Jesus say? Jesus wanted to reinforce to the Jews that salvation is not a transaction in which there is a fair exchange of goods. Salvation is about a relational exchange of commitment to a shared friendship. Jesus said, what do you want to do the works of God? I want you to believe in the one whom he has sent. I want you to connect and trust and establish a friendship with the one whom he has sent. I would like to suggest today that in Jesus' teaching, salvation is never transactional. It is always relational. The righteous judge is making his determination not on our aptitude, what we can do, but on our attitude. Would you agree? It's not about competence as much as it is about confidence. It's not what we are capable of doing as much as in whom we have put our trust. Paul's farewell passage to Timothy emphasises attitude before aptitude and confidence before competence. God knows those who have set their affection on his appearing. He knows those who have put their confidence in him. The Good News paraphrase translates it this way: that the righteous judge will give me on that day, and not to me only, but to all those who wait with love for him to appear. Eugene Peterson, in his paraphrase, The Message, says it this way: that God will give the reward to everyone eager for his coming. And the New American Standard Bible, which is a very tight translation, it tries as best as it can to just translate Greek for English without reorganising and interrupting the flow of the original argument, has it this way: that the reward will be given to all who have loved his appearing. Do you get a sense in this passage from Paul that there's a big difference between concessional admission and passionate excitement? Conceding that a truth makes sense versus I'm really excited about this truth in my heart. Being right with God, being the recipient of the reward he wants to give, is ultimately going to come down to attitude, to motive. This is not a concession where we agree that God is right, but that we love that God is right. Is there a difference? I'm willing to admit that the tax office is right, but I don't have much affection for it. Is there anyone here who loves the ATO? My accountant is symmetrical in her face and is a reasonably nice person, but I still break into hives the minute I open the door and step into her office. She's good with numbers and she does her job well, but I could never say that she's on my list of favourite people. No, I don't like accountants, Jasper. They always, don't they, Yvette? They always seem to create a new bill. I'm not excited about them. But anyway, the point that I will make is that we can have a similar attitude to God as we have to the tax office or our accountant. We can concede that he's fair and just and right and that his figures add up and that his sense of justice is according to the law. But God is not asking us to concede that he is right. He wants us to fall in love with him. He wants us to have connection and relational integrity. And we get a sense of this because Paul cleverly, in his closing message to Timothy, juxtaposes this idea of loving his appearing with another kind of love. 2 verses later he says, Demas, my companion, my fellow apostle, has deserted me. Why? Because he loved the present age. And he has gone to Thessalonica, Crescens to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. In contrast to those who have loved his appearing, Demas, a fellow apostle, loses his love for Christ and he exchanges it for a love of this present age. Thessalonica, for those of you who have never been to visit there, is still in existence. Thessaloniki, we call it today. And it's still a very, very large centre of influence in Greece. But in Jesus' day, in Paul's day, Thessaloniki was one of the premier cities of the Roman and Byzantine and Greek empires. It was right at the crossroads of two major trade routes, one running east-west and one running north-south. And Thessalonica was kind of, if we can say that Rome was like Canberra, then Thessaloniki was like Melbourne. It was the place of culture and concerts and music and influence, and it was an economic powerhouse. And it had all of the bright lights and shiny attractions that were necessary to dissuade somebody who had set their sights on a future kingdom to become deceived into the immediacy and proximity of what the world has to offer now. And so Paul sets these two things. There are those who have loved his appearing and who are waiting in anticipation for a future reward. And there are those who have fallen in love with everything this world has to offer in this present moment. Paul wrote a letter to the church in Thessalonica, and in his second epistle to the church in Thessalonica, he says this: "The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing." Why do people perish? Because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. I wonder, as Paul was sitting down there and writing to the church in Thessalonica, whether he was wondering, where is Demas? Where is my fellow apostle? Where is that man who stood so strongly for the gospel but then was so easily dissuaded into letting go in order to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season? And maybe as he's thinking of Demas, as he's writing this letter, he pens these words: people will be lost because they love the wrong thing. They choose to exchange the love of the truth for the love of immediacy and proximity. You know, a good friend, my favourite writer, Ellen White, in the late 19th century, wrote these words: "The greatest deception of the human mind in Christ's day was that a mere assent to the truth constitutes righteousness. In all human experience, a theoretical knowledge of the truth has been proved to be insufficient for the saving of the soul. The same danger still exists. Many take it for granted that they are Christians simply because they agree with certain theological ideas. But they have not brought the truth into the practical life. They have not believed and loved it. Therefore, they have never received the power and grace that come through sanctification of the truth. Men may profess faith in the truth, but if it does not make them sincere, kind, patient, forbearing, heavenly minded, it is accursed to its possessors, and through their influence, it is a curse to the world." They're solemn words, aren't they? There is a huge difference between concessional agreement with a set of propositions and a heart-throbbing love for Jesus. And I want to challenge you as I challenge myself. I put the words down almost tomorrow because, in a sense, I kind of feel it's almost tomorrow. Would you agree? And I originally started off wanting to preach a sermon on heaven, but I got distracted. And I'm not going to use this as an introduction and launch into a proper sermon. I'm wrapping up. You know, January at my place, we were in extreme drought. Drought like we've never seen before. February, we were in flood. Rained like it hasn't rained for a long time. March potentially can be dominated internationally by the coronavirus and the threat of economic instability. Or, as we alluded to early, There may be a refreshed optimism by a group of people who cannot afford to have any thoughts of an imminent apocalypse. Those in positions of power and influence will do their best to speak messages of optimism and hope, to encourage people to continue to invest in stocks and bonds and not to do a run on the banks or run to the hills. Saints, whatever happens, let me tell you this from my observation as a mere peasant, but as an existential truth that I think all of us experience. The veneer of civility is very thin. Taylor was probably lived long enough to remember what happened in New Orleans after one of those terrible hurricanes came up from the Gulf of Mexico and took out a city, and the incivility that reigned in the streets. Houses being broken into, shops being looted. The rule of law was broken in a day. And this is in a country that holds itself as the epitome of law and order and setting an example of what democracy and civilised living should look like. But we are at best one day away from incivility. Would you agree? I don't know when that day will be, and I don't want to stand here making any apocalyptic predictions. But what I want to say is, as a Christian, I'm so excited that Jesus has promised to rescue all those that have put their trust in him. I'm just in the process of watering 3 baby macadamia trees. I'm now a macadamia farmer. I feel quite posh. And the person who gave me those macadamia trees told me it's going to be 5 years before I can hope to pick a nut. Yvette and I are in the process of borrowing vast sums of money to build a business that may not bring an economic return till Jared has grandchildren. I'm not in any mood to run to the hills, and I'm not advocating irresponsibility or any kind of histrionics or conspiracy theories or any of that nonsense. But as Seventh-day Adventists, we have been saying since our inception, Jesus is coming again. Would you agree? Jesus is coming again. How long is this world of sin going to last? What is our answer? Not forever. Not forever. There will come a moment in human history when Jesus will come back. And to those who have loved his appearing, they will be awarded the victor's crown. Let us not be like those who fall in love with this present world and let go of their friendship with God. I think the world is in a precarious place. But I want to suggest that Paul's message to Timothy is that the key factor between those who are saved and lost are those who have a genuine, abiding friendship with God. And relational integrity is often doubted when a 23-year-old lady marries an 80-year-old billionaire on the pretense that they both share a love for Royal Dalton China and the music of Glen Miller. Would you agree? We somehow doubt the genuineness of what we would call a gold digger relationship, where the real reason that the transaction and the relationship and the connection and the certificate is being signed is that this 23-year-old expects this 80-year-old to die soon and to gain the inheritance. And what a tragedy if that was happening in the church, where when it looked like the final crisis was about to envelop the world, people came along and said, I don't really love him, but I'm really interested in his assets. So I might pretend to have a relationship with him and see if it has merit. Saints, the righteous judge will not be fooled by a hand of God goal. He knows those that love him and those that love this present world. Because we love him, we will love what he loves, and we will want to live where he lives. You know, we don't have to wait till tomorrow. we can be different today. We can read his word, we can meditate on his creation, we can resonate with his character, we can share our passion for his truth with others. I want to ask you the question, who or what are you in love with? When that small cloud appears on the eastern horizon, are you going to be mourning your earthly assets about to be dissolved in a fiery conflagration? Or will you lift up your head and say, "Lo, this is my God. I have connected my story with his story, and now he will save me."